2 or 3 years ago, I was listening to a program on NPR entitled Performance Today. Performance Today is a program of classical music or music written in the classical style, performed by modern artists. And they will feature different orchestras, different ensembles, or different soloists each week. It's on Wednesday mornings. I don't remember what time it's on, but this particular week they featured a musician. I don't know if he was an instrumentalist or a vocalist, but he had been asked to judge a music contest for probably high school students, maybe university, probably high school. And at music contests, there are always more than one judge, because that's kind of a subjective rating. So there's at least two, usually three judges. Before the contest started, he spoke to the contestants. And in his speech, he started his speech by saying, "Most of you are losers. Most of you are not going to win this contest." And, what a terribly insensitive, cruel thing to say. But then he went on to say, years ago, that he had been a participant in a similar contest when he was a young man, and he didn't win. And as a matter of fact, one of the judges wrote in the critique that you have absolutely no musical talent or ability. There is no future for you in music, and you need to get into a line of work that you can succeed at. He said, "I am a member of the Club of Losers." And his point was that we're all going to lose sometime in our lives. We're not going to win every time. But that doesn't make you a failure. So what's that got to do with us? Well, there are quite a few card-carrying members of the Club of Losers in the Bible. How about Abraham? He lied at least twice about his relationship with Sarah. Said that Sarah was his sister. Well, that was kind of true. She was his half-sister, but she was also his wife. And he may have lied more than twice, but we just don't know about it. But on at least two occasions that we know about, he said that Sarah is my sister. He kind of lost that contest, didn't he? Later, he decided that he would help God out a little bit. God had told him that he would father a great nation, that all nations of the earth would be blessed through his descendant. And he was an old man. Sarah was an old woman. She was past the age of bearing children. So they decided that they would help God out a little bit, and he could have a son by her slave. He lost that contest too, didn't he? He didn't really believe that God could do what he told him he would do. But in James 2 and verse 23, the Bible says that he was called God's friend. Wow. Here's a card-carrying member of the Club of Losers, and he's God's friend. Don't you think he got discouraged sometimes when things weren't going the way he thought they should have been? But ultimately, he trusted in God and he didn't give up. How about Samson? Now, there's a member of the club of losers. He lost a contest with his groomsmen, 30 of them. That's a big wedding, huh? And it cost him 30 sets of clothes and his wife. His wife was given to somebody else. And then sometime later, he fell in love with Delilah, and we're all familiar with how that story came out. That cost him his eyesight and ultimately cost him his life. But the Old Testament must not tell us everything there is to know about Samson, because Samson is listed in Hebrews 11 as being one of the heroes of faith. Samson is called a man of faith. So, in spite of all his losses, he must have been a man that was truly faithful to God, or he wouldn't have been enlisted. He wouldn't have been listed in Hebrews 11. Samson was a card-carrying member of the club of losers. How about David? David was one of Saul's favorite and best generals. And then Saul turned on him, and he spent the next several years hiding from Saul in the desert, staying just far enough ahead of him to keep from Saul catching him and executing him. Meanwhile, he lost his wife, and even after becoming king, he made some rather poor decisions, didn't he? He committed adultery with one of his best soldiers' wives, and then murdered the soldier to try and cover it up. He also conducted a census that God had forbidden the Israelites to do, and that cost not only him, it cost the nation of Israel a 3-day plague. And yet, in Acts 13 and verse 22, David is called a man after God's own heart. A card-carrying member of the club of losers, but he was a man after God's own heart. How about Solomon? He definitely was a member, wasn't he? For being such a wise man, he made an awful lot of foolish decisions, not the least of which was marrying 1,000 women, if you count the 300 concubines as wives. If you don't count them as wives, he married 700 women. Still a lot of women, and still contrary to God's law. And those women were mostly pagans, and they led him into idolatry, and he even constructed temples for the idol gods of his wives. He was a member of the club of losers. But he wound up writing 3 books of the Bible. And Ecclesiastes seems to have been written, or at least to me, seems to have been written close to the end of his life. And in Ecclesiastes, he seems to be saying, I had it all and I blew it. I messed up. Did Solomon ever get his life squared away? I kind of think maybe he did in the last part of his life. So, Solomon was a member of the club of losers, and yet he wrote three books of the Bible. But that was the Old Testament. How about the New Testament? Well, how about Nicodemus? Nicodemus was a Pharisee, and the Pharisees were a very strict sect of the Jews. they were so careful about making sure that they didn't violate any of God's laws, that they made laws of their own. And Jesus tells them, you're worshiping me in vain, because the rules that you are making are just rules of men. They wanted to make sure, they were very meticulous, wanted to make sure that they didn't do anything wrong. They were so right that they were wrong. And that sounds like a contradiction, but I don't think it is. Because Jesus said, what they tell you to do, you do it, because they are teaching you the truth, but don't do like they do. Because they were hypocrites. Not all of them were hypocrites, but most of them were. Nicodemus came to Jesus by night. Well, why did he do that? Bible doesn't tell us, but I suspect it was because he didn't want the other Pharisees to know he was there. And he had a hard time understanding what Jesus was trying to teach him. But later, we find in John 7, verses 50 through 51, that he defends Jesus. He says, does our law condemn anyone before we have heard what they're doing and actually give them a fair hearing? And he was pretty soundly criticized by the other Pharisees for having said that. And later, when Jesus was crucified, he helped Joseph of Arimathea bury Jesus' body. Did Nicodemus ever obey the gospel? The Bible doesn't tell us, but I suspect he probably did. A member of the Losers Club, but I suspect Nicodemus was probably a Christian. How about Nathanael? Nathanael the skeptic. When Philip found Jesus, or rather Jesus found Philip, first thing Philip did was to go and get his friend Nathanael and tell him, we've found the Messiah. It's Jesus of Nazareth. Nathanael says nothing good ever comes out of Nazareth. Can't be the Messiah. Philip says, well, come and see. Nathanael, the skeptical apostle. So he goes to see if this could possibly be the Messiah, and Jesus sees him coming, and what does Jesus say about Nathanael? A true Israelite in whom there is nothing false. Wow. I hope that when I get to the judgment, Jesus will tell his Father, there's a true Christian in whom there is nothing false. But I'm not sure that he could say that about me. But he said it about Nathanael, a card-carrying member of the Club of Losers, and yet Jesus admired Nathanael. Wow. How about Simon the Zealot? Some people say, well, they called him the Zealot because he was very zealous as far as his religion was concerned. I have a little trouble with that. I think we can take the Bible at its word. I think Simon was a member of the sect called the Zealots. The Zealots, we would call them terrorists today. They hated the Romans, as did most Jews, but they went farther than just hating them. They were trying to actively overthrow the Roman government in Palestine and kick the Romans out. They would look for Roman soldiers and jump them and beat them up or even kill them. We would call the zealots terrorists today. Simon was definitely a member of the club of losers. But Jesus saw something in Simon that he could use, and he picked him as one of his apostles. How about Thomas? What do you think of when you hear the name Thomas? Same thing I do, probably. Doubting Thomas. I won't believe that Jesus has risen until I can actually touch the nail prints and actually touch the spear wound in his side. That's what we think about when we think of Thomas. But the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about Thomas. But it tells us in John 11, verse 16, Jesus is getting ready to go back to Judea. The Jews have been trying to kill Jesus, and his apostles are trying to talk him out of going back to Judea. They said, "Don't you know that they're trying to kill you?" Jesus says, "We're going back to Judea." What did Thomas say? Thomas says, "Well, let's go with him so that we can die with him." We don't think about that when we think about Thomas, do we? We think about doubting Thomas. But Thomas was a card-carrying member of the club of losers, and yet he was the one that said, "Let's go back to Judea so that we can die with Jesus." How about James and John? Mark 3 and verse 17 says that Jesus gave them the nickname of sons of thunder. Now, I don't know what that means. Maybe it means that they just talked louder than any of the rest. Maybe it means that they talked a lot, but I kind of doubt it. I imagine that says something about their temperament. I imagine they had a rather short fuse and that they had kind of a hot temper. And we know that they're the ones that wanted to call down fire on the Samaritans, on the Samaritan village that wouldn't let Jesus and the apostles come in. The sons of thunder. Members of the club of losers. But John wrote 5 books of the New Testament, more than anybody else except for Paul. And he's referred to as the apostle of love. One of the sons of thunder who wanted to call down fire on the Samaritans. How about Matthew? Matthew, the tax collector. Now, there was a loser. As far as the Jews were concerned, anyway, they hated the tax collectors because they considered them traitors. They were Jews who worked for the Roman government. And they're not like the IRS today, who are, for the most part, the vast majority of people who work for the IRS are career bureaucrats. They're just doing their job. They're not crooked. They're just honest, hardworking individuals that don't get enough credit. That's not what the publicans were, the tax collectors of Jesus' time. Not only were they the tax collectors, they were the tax assessors. Now and they worked on commission. Now you can see how that would be open to corruption. Because if you had your pecan crop, I don't think they would grow pecans in the Middle East, but we do around here, so we're familiar with that. If you wanted to sell your pecan crop, you had to go to the tax collector to have your taxes assessed. And if it was, I don't know what the pecan market is, but if it was $5 a pound, the publican would quite probably assess it at $7 a pound. And then that extra $2, that was his. They routinely upped the value of the commodities that they were taxing, and they kept everything that was above what they had contracted with the Roman government to collect. Now you can see how that would really be a system that would be open for corruption. Who in the world is going to pay attention to Matthew's preaching when they knew that he was a tax collector? Now, I don't know if Matthew was a dishonest tax collector or not. I kind of doubt it, but you're not going to convince the Jews of that. And yet Jesus saw something in Matthew that he could use. And then the one that I can really identify with is Peter, the impulsive one, always saying something inappropriate. Told Jesus that when Jesus said, we're going to Jerusalem and I am going to be murdered, no, you're not. That's never going to happen to you. Jesus actually said, Peter, Satan, I don't think Jesus was calling Peter the devil, but he said, get behind me because you're not helping. And then in the garden, before they went to the garden, I will never disown you. All of these other guys might, not me. And in fairness to Peter, all the rest of them said the same thing. And he meant it. He was brave in the garden. He whipped out his sword, cut off a guy's ear. He must not have been a real good swordsman, but he lopped off the guy's ear. And Jesus said, put your sword away. This is not the way it's going to happen. And then just a little while later, he denied 3 times that he knew Jesus. And that's not the only time Peter messed up. Remember his hypocritical attitude towards the Gentile Christians that Paul actually had to rebuke him publicly? Peter, a card-carrying member of the Losers Club. But you know what? Later on, Peter refers to Paul as our beloved brother Paul. So he didn't hold a grudge, did he? And how about Paul? Paul was a Pharisee. He was on his way up in the Jewish religion. He probably would have been a member of the Sanhedrin if he wasn't already, but he probably wasn't already, but he probably would have been eventually. He was a persecutor of the church. We know that he participated in the murder of at least one person, Stephen, and I think there were probably more than that because Paul says when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them, plural. So I think there was more than one. He was a persecutor a murderer, and he refers to himself as the least of the apostles, a card-carrying member of the club of losers. But God saw something in Paul that he could use. And we said that John wrote 5 books of the New Testament. Paul wrote most of the rest of them. Not all of them, but most of them. They were all members of the Losers Club, but God was able to use every one of them. But what's that got to do with us? That was then, this is now. Well, in Romans 3, verse 23, it reads that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Every one of us are card-carrying members of the club of losers. We have all messed up at one time or another, more than once probably, in our lives. But in Romans 6, verse 23, it says that salvation is the gift of God. We don't have to stay in that losers club. We can have our sins forgiven. And most of us, I guess all of us here, have obeyed the gospel. But we can't keep all the goodies to ourselves. It's our responsibility to reach out to those around us who haven't been saved or who have fallen away after having been saved. And you know what? We don't have to have our lives completely squared away in order to be able to share the gospel with others. Is there anybody here that doesn't have anything in their life that they wish they could change? I'm not one of them. We don't have to be completely squared away to be able to share the gospel with those around us. And by the same token, you don't have to know all there is to know to obey the gospel. You're never going to know all there is to know. We read several passages, we read 7 passages in Revelation a little earlier. And what did they all say? They all said, to him who overcomes, and then God would give them a reward of some kind. It's all the same reward. It's heaven. It's just, he just phrases it a little differently. But maybe you think there's no hope for you, that your life is a mess, that you messed up and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, you're not in any worse shape than Simon the Zealot, who was out. I don't know if Simon participated in violence or not, but he was a member of a violent organization that went around killing Roman soldiers. So you're no more messed up than Simon was. Maybe you think you don't know enough to obey the gospel. I don't think there's anybody here that hasn't obeyed the gospel, but 3,000 people on the day of Pentecost obeyed the gospel. And what did they know? They knew that Jesus was the Son of God. They knew that he died for their sins. They knew they were sinners. They knew that Jesus raised from the dead. They knew that baptism was for the forgiveness of sins. That's what they knew. So when we're trying to teach people to obey the gospel, that's really all they need to know. Now, they're going to have to learn more as they go along in life and as a Christian. But that's all they need to know to be baptized. Because that's what the 3,000 on the day of Pentecost knew. And that's all they knew at that time. So, we're all card-carrying members of the club of losers. But that doesn't make us failures. We're only failures if we give up. But anybody that misses heaven, you're a failure. I'm a failure if I miss heaven. It doesn't matter what a person might accomplish in life. If they miss heaven, they're a failure. God's not impressed by professional athletes. He's not impressed by great scientists. He doesn't reject them either just because they're athletes or scientists, but he's not impressed by that. What he's impressed is with humility and obedience. I don't see anybody here tonight that hasn't obeyed the Gospels, but maybe you need the prayers of the church, or maybe there's something else that we can help you out with in your life. And if so, let us know while we stand and sing the song that's been selected.